HOA Karen tries to evict Kevin Hart, unaware he's the owner of her house. The sun spilled over the cul-de-sac like melted gold, warming the pristine sidewalks and neatly trimmed lawns of Willow Creek Estates. It was the kind of neighborhood that came with rules etched in stone, where grass height was monitored with measuring tape and porch furniture had seasonal deadlines. Kevin Hart eased his matte black Range Rover into the driveway of 1186, Fairmont Lane, windows down, music low. He had been gone 6 months, finalizing overseas property deals, but the house was still his, paid in full, no mortgage, no tenants supposed to be inside. So when a woman in high-waisted khakis and an HOA-issued name badge stormed toward him, finger already jabbing the air, he raised one eyebrow and killed the engine. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. You can't park here, she snapped, standing so close he could smell her citrus-scented sanitizer. This is private property. Kevin let out a slow breath. And you are? I'm Karen, head of the HOA and owner of this property, she said, sweeping her hand like a game show host revealing a prize. Now, unless you want me to call the authorities, I suggest you turn this vehicle around and leave. A small laugh bubbled up in Kevin's throat, but he swallowed it. Instead, he glanced at the address on the mailbox, then back at her. Same place. No mistake. Her face, tight with forced authority, looked like it had never been told no. She was the kind who corrected store clerks mid-sentence and carried leashes for dogs she didn't own. But Kevin wasn't dressed like a man who owned the house. His hoodie bore no logos. His joggers were relaxed, his sneakers clean but discreet. And to Karen, ownership had a look, and he didn't fit it. I'm just here to check on something, he said, voice smooth, casual. Won't take long. Karen crossed her arms. Don't play coy. We've had problems with squatters before. This neighborhood has standards. And if you're one of those men taking pictures to flip homes you don't own. Kevin tilted his head. Flip homes I don't own, he echoed. She smirked, mistaking his calm for confusion. Oh, I've seen it before. You people come in, pretending to be potential buyers or handymen, then squat, make false claims, and sue when evicted. That landed like ice water down his spine. You people. The words slithered past her teeth without hesitation, unbothered, like they belonged in casual conversation. Kevin felt his jaw tighten, the weight of restraint pressing down hard. He'd spent years building himself up from foster care to Forbes, not for validation but for protection. Power meant you didn't have to raise your voice. You just waited. Funny, he said, stepping out of the car slowly. I was told the tenant would have vacated by now. Karen blinked. What tenant? The one who signed a lease under an LLC I control. Lease expired a month ago. For the first time, her lips parted without sound. A beat passed, then two. She laughed, the sound dry and forced. Nice try. I've lived here for 5 years. I rent from the Wilshire Realty Group, and I'm in good standing. Kevin smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Wilshire Realty Group is a shell company, created to protect the identities of private owners. One of those identities, he said, reaching into his glove box and retrieving a folded document, is mine. She snatched the paper, scanning it. Her eyebrows twitched, but she forced a scoff. Anybody can print a fake deed. I don't know what scam you're running, but it's not going to work here. He took the paper back and slipped it into his coat pocket. No need to argue. Not today. This was reconnaissance. He needed to see just how far her ignorance went, how deep her entitlement would carry her. I'll be back, Kevin said, sliding on his sunglasses. Enjoy your day, Karen. She stood rooted, her expression caught between fury and disbelief as he drove off slow, like he had all the time in the world. And he did. Behind the wheel, Kevin's thoughts churned. She doesn't even know she's trespassing on property she's calling hers. How poetic. There was no need to confront her yet. Not when the story was just beginning. He didn't just want her gone. He wanted her to see the layers she'd never bothered to look past. And that revelation would come in time. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. Because sometimes, poetic justice didn't come as a bang. It arrived in silence, dressed in a hoodie, and parked right in your driveway. The next morning, Kevin sat in his car across the street, sipping his coffee, watching. The neighborhood was already awake, humming with the usual suburban rituals, dog walkers pacing the sidewalks, sprinklers ticking in slow, mechanical arcs, early risers waving at each other with the forced friendliness of people who spent too much time in each other's business. And there, in the center of it all, was Karen, clipboard in hand, patrolling. She moved with the confidence of self-appointed authority, pausing in front of homes to scribble notes, inspecting mailboxes like they were security checkpoints. A self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood standards. Kevin had seen her kind before, people who mistook control for power, who built small kingdoms out of paperwork and privilege, ruling over others with rules they never had to follow themselves. A sharp knock on his window jolted him from his thoughts. He turned slowly, met with the narrowed eyes of a man in his late 50s, wearing a golf polo a size too tight. The HOA's enforcer, no doubt. "Morning," the man said, tone edged with suspicion. "Haven't seen you around here before." Kevin smiled, sipping his coffee. "That's funny. I own the place right there." He gestured toward his house, watching for the reaction. The man hesitated, eyes darting to the home, then back to Kevin. Karen mentioned something about a suspicious vehicle. Said a man was loitering around her property yesterday. Kevin exhaled through his nose. Her property. The lie had already spread like wildfire. He could almost hear Karen's voice spinning the story, how she bravely confronted an intruder, how she saved the neighborhood from God knows what. "I'll clear this up real fast for you," Kevin said, reaching into his glove box and pulling out the deed. He handed it over, watching the man's expression shift as he scanned the document. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Well, that's, huh." The man cleared his throat, handing the paper back. "Must be some confusion then." "Oh, I don't think there's any confusion." Kevin tucked the deed away, his tone light but edged. "But I do think Karen has a bad habit of assuming ownership that doesn't belong to her." The man gave a forced chuckle, retreating a step. I'll let her know. Sorry about the misunderstanding." Kevin nodded once, watching him scurry off like a man who'd touched a live wire. He could have left it at that. Could have waited for the truth to unravel naturally. But he knew Karen. Wouldn't let it go. She wouldn't back down, wouldn't admit she was wrong. No, she'd double down. And he wanted to see just how far she'd go. Later that afternoon, his prediction came true. A white HOA notice was taped to the front door of his house. Unauthorized occupancy. Immediate compliance required. Kevin laughed under his breath as he peeled it off. She had no clue who she was playing with. By evening, the battle had escalated. Karen had summoned a small assembly on her lawn, 3 middle-aged women and a balding man in loafers, all gathered like jurors deliberating a crime. Kevin leaned against his car, watching. Karen pointed toward his house, her voice rising, hands animated. "I ran a background check. No record of a Kevin Hart owning any home in this neighborhood." Kevin smiled to himself. Of course, she wouldn't find his name. He'd bought the house under one of his LLCs, a simple legal shield, standard for investors. One of the women hesitated. "But if he has the deed?" Karen waved her off. "Forged. Scam artists are getting good these days." That was enough for Kevin. He pushed off the car, slow and deliberate, making his way across the street. He didn't speak until he was standing right in the center of their little circle. "Something I should know about?" Karen stiffened, but her lips curled into a practiced smile. "Oh, just keeping the neighborhood safe. You know how it is." Kevin nodded, gaze steady. "Funny. That's exactly what I'm doing." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folder, handing it straight to her. "Official county records. Deed transfer. Tax statements. HOA compliance. Everything proving I own this house." Karen's smile cracked at the edges. She flipped through the papers, skin paling with every page. Kevin leaned in slightly. "See, Karen, I don't need to prove anything to you. But since you're so concerned about keeping things up to standard, I figured I'd make sure you know exactly who you're dealing with." For the first time, she had nothing to say. Kevin let the silence stretch between them, thick and heavy, before turning on his heel and heading back to his house. Game on. By sunrise the next morning, Kevin was already settled into a foldable lawn chair on his front yard, sipping from a thermos of dark roast coffee and watching the world orbit around Karen's denial. He had positioned himself squarely in the middle of the yard, hoodie pulled low, sunglasses on, posture relaxed, like a king on a quiet throne. Birds chirped. A few neighbors peeked from behind blinds. Kevin didn't move. He just watched. Waited. Because he knew she'd come. She had to. And she did, at precisely 8:03 a.m. Clad in a pink windbreaker and armed with a clipboard like it was a courtroom gavel, Karen stormed down the sidewalk like a woman with divine purpose. Her face was a canvas of disbelief and indignation, her steps quick and clipped. She didn't stop at the edge of his lawn. She walked straight up to him, her shadow casting itself across his feet like a warning. "You can't be here," she snapped. "I've already filed a formal complaint with the HOA board. You've got until the end of the day to remove yourself and that camping chair from the premises." Kevin took a slow sip of his coffee and didn't look up. Didn't know drinking coffee on your own lawn was considered loitering now. Karen's nostrils flared. "Don't play cute. I know what this is. You're trying to intimidate me. But let me tell you something. People like me don't scare easy." He looked at her then, finally lifting his sunglasses to rest them on his head. "No," he said calmly. "People like you never do. That's part of the problem." Karen blinked, thrown off by the gentleness of his tone. He reached into the manila folder resting beside his chair and pulled out a document. It was worn now, with creases from being handled too many times in the last few days. He held it out like an offering. "Deed. Original. Not a copy. Not a scan. Official stamp and all. You can verify it with the county clerk's office. Or with the HOA's own property management files. They have it on record." Karen didn't take it. She stared at it as if touching it might confirm the nightmare creeping into her mind. "I don't believe this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I know," Kevin replied, folding it back and tucking it into the folder. "But your belief isn't required. The truth stands whether you face it or not." The silence between them thickened like storm clouds, heavy with unspoken things. Karen opened her mouth to speak again, but nothing came out. Kevin could see it clearly now, the fracture in her reality. She was trying to reconcile the contradiction. A black man sitting confidently on a lawn she thought belonged to her, telling her she was the one who had to go. "I've lived here for 5 years, she said finally, voice hoarse. "I pay rent. On time. Every month. I've mowed this lawn. Painted that porch. Decorated for the holidays." Kevin raised an eyebrow. "And yet, not once did you think to check who your landlord really was?" Karen stiffened. "Wilshire Realty Group is a holding company," Kevin cut in. "Owned by an LLC. And that LLC," he paused, tapping his chest, "belongs to me." Her eyes trembled, darting across the lawn like maybe someone would appear and tell her it was a joke. But no one came. Kevin stood slowly, folding his chair with one hand. "Here's what's going to happen. You've got 30 days to vacate. Lease expired last month. You've already overstayed." Karen's voice cracked. "You can't do that." "I can. And I will. Paperwork's already filed. But I'm the head of the HOA. And I'm the owner of this house," Kevin said, letting the words drop like stones. "Which makes you a guest who's outstayed her welcome." For the first time, Karen looked genuinely shaken. Her authority, once airtight and unchecked, was unraveling thread by thread. And Kevin didn't gloat. He didn't smile or mock or raise his voice. That wasn't his style. He turned and walked back inside, leaving her alone on the lawn she no longer had a right to patrol. Inside, the air felt lighter somehow. Like dignity had walked through the front door and locked it behind him. And outside, Kevin knew, Karen was staring at the house as if it had betrayed her. But the truth was simpler than betrayal. It was justice finally pulling up a chair. Kevin barely slept that night. Not because of stress. No, he'd already won the war. But because his mind was worrying with something deeper than revenge. It was clarity. The kind that comes after years of pretending you're not bothered by people like Karen. After decades of shrinking your presence, just enough to make others comfortable. But now, he was done dimming his light. And it showed. By morning, the air in Willow Creek Estates buzzed with tension. Kevin's presence was no longer a secret. Karen had made sure of that. She had gone door to door the previous evening, rattling on porches like a town crier, spreading her gospel of paranoia and loss. Her story shifted each time. Kevin was a scammer, a squatter, a hacker who'd stolen her lease. Anything but the truth. Anything but a wealthy black man who owned more than just the house she lived in. He owned the very silence she used to rule over. Kevin watched from his front window as the ripple effect played out. Neighbors now eyed him with a blend of curiosity and confusion. Some offered awkward nods. Others avoided eye contact altogether. And a few, braver, or perhaps more honest, gave subtle gestures of support. A wave here. A quiet thumbs up there. The neighborhood was dividing, and not along the lines Karen had anticipated. Mid-morning, a white Lexus pulled into the driveway. Kevin's attorney, Sandra Reyes, stepped out, her heels clicking with precision on the concrete. She was a shark in human skin, elegant, ruthless, and fluent in the language of power. She didn't knock. She never did. He opened the door before she reached it. "I filed the formal 30-day notice," she said, handing him a copy. "Certified mail. Signed receipt. Karen's officially been served." Kevin took it, skimming the contents. "And the HOA? Already updated their records," Sandra replied, slipping off her sunglasses. "They were surprisingly cooperative after I sent them the ownership ledger and a polite reminder about discrimination liability." Kevin let out a low chuckle. Amazing how fast people change when you start speaking their language. Sandra's lips curved into a knowing smile. Money, paper trails, lawsuits. That's the only dialect they truly understand. They sat in his kitchen, the clean lines of the modern decor clashing with the tension brewing outside. Kevin watched her over his mug. "You think she'll leave quietly?" Sandra raised an eyebrow. "Does Karen strike you as someone who does anything quietly?" Kevin shook his head. "No. She's going to make this ugly." Sandra leaned forward. "Then we'll be uglier. But smarter." They were still talking when the knock came. Not the kind of knock that asked for permission, but the kind that demanded entry. Kevin rose slowly and opened the door. Karen stood on the porch flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Her face was flushed, lips tight with righteous fury. "This is the man," she said to the taller officer. "He's been harassing me. He trespassed on my property. He threatened me." Kevin's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. The officer turned to him. "Sir, we got a call about a domestic dispute. Do you live here?" "I do," Kevin replied, stepping aside. "You're welcome to come in. I've got every piece of documentation you'll need." Karen scoffed. "Don't fall for this. He's lying. He's pretending to be the owner." Sandra appeared behind Kevin, holding out the folder. "Not pretending. Here's the deed. His name's not on it, but the LLC that owns the house belongs to my client. I'm his legal counsel." The officers exchanged a glance as they took the paperwork. One of them moved to a quiet corner to radio dispatch. The other began reading, flipping through the stamped pages. Karen's voice rose. "You can't just walk in here and steal a home. I have rights." Sandra remained calm. "Yes, you do. And so does the property owner. That's why we filed through proper legal channels. No one's stealing anything, Karen. You're being evicted, legally." The officer returned. "Ma'am, records match the documents. This man is listed as the legal property owner through the LLC. I suggest you start preparing to leave." Karen's expression collapsed. Her voice faltered for the first time. "But I didn't know." Kevin looked her in the eye. "That's the problem, Karen. You didn't know. And you never bothered to ask." She stood there, frozen, as if her entire sense of self had been peeled away. For years, she had built a throne on assumptions. And now the ground beneath it was crumbling. Kevin closed the door gently, the final sound like a gavel falling. The king had reclaimed his castle. And the queen of complaints? She was running out of rules to hide behind. The neighborhood felt quieter after the police left, but it wasn't peace. It was the hush that follows an earthquake. Doors stayed closed. Conversations shrank into murmurs. Even the children's laughter sounded cautious, like joy had to tiptoe now. Karen's empire of whispers had collapsed in a single afternoon, and the rubble was still settling across the cul-de-sac. Kevin sat by the large bay window in his living room, sipping tea, watching the street like a man who'd reclaimed his name. He wasn't interested in petty revenge. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about accountability, the kind Karen had never been forced to face. For years, she'd built her authority on assumption, woven her power from entitlement. Now, without her lies, her clipboard, and her concerns, she was just another tenant, an unwelcome guest with 30 days to pack up her pride. But Karen wasn't done. 3 days later, Kevin opened his mailbox and found a bright orange citation folded neatly around his electricity bill. Violation: lawn not edged to HOA standard. He stared at the thin paper, its language bloated with jargon. It was ridiculous, but expected. Karen was striking back the only way she knew how. Paper cuts disguised as policy. That same evening, a second notice was taped to his trash bin. Improper bin placement. Must be stored 12 inches from garage exterior. Kevin laughed when he read it. The absurdity wasn't new. It was her last act of defiance, weaponizing the rules she used to bully others, now turned into desperate darts thrown at the wind. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that Kevin had anticipated every move. He called a landscaper the next morning. Not just any gardener, but Tarek, a black-owned business owner with a reputation for meticulous work and clean edges, so crisp they could slice glass. Within hours, Kevin's lawn was edged, trimmed, mulched, and manicured to perfection. Even the air around it seemed impressed. He snapped photos, time-stamped, and sent them to the HOA with a polite email. Compliance complete. Please confirm. Then he went further. He filed a request with the HOA board to audit recent citations issued by Karen during her term as head of committee enforcement. Sandra, his attorney, drafted the request, citing possible abuse of authority and selective enforcement. Kevin didn't need the board to act immediately. All he needed was the ripple. And it worked. A week later, during a routine HOA meeting, a surprising topic made its way to the agenda: review of enforcement practices and potential restructuring of committee leadership. Kevin didn't even need to attend. Word reached him through a neighbor, a quiet woman named Linda, who had once been fined $200 by Karen for planting non-approved tulips. Linda's email was brief but telling. She looked pale, sweating. I've never seen her that quiet. Still, Karen wasn't finished. She had one more card to play. Kevin was pulling into his driveway one afternoon when a black SUV blocked him in. A man stepped out, broad-shouldered, gold watch, hair slicked back like a corporate ghost. He introduced himself as Greg Tolman, regional director of Wilshire Realty Group, the same company Karen insisted had managed her lease. We've had a complaint from the tenant regarding unlawful eviction, Greg said, trying to sound neutral. Kevin chuckled. I figured she'd try this. I need to verify your ownership of the property, Greg continued, clearly unaware of who he was dealing with. Kevin stepped closer, lowered his voice just enough to land like thunder. I'm Kevin Hart. I bought Wilshire Realty Group 2 years ago through one of my umbrella companies. I am your boss. Greg blinked, confused. Kevin pulled out his phone, swiping to an email chain from the acquisition: legal signatures, wire receipts, tax filings. Everything. Greg's jaw slackened. You own Wilshire? Kevin's smile was calm but cutting. And that means Karen's lease was under my name all along. Greg swallowed hard. I'll relay this to corporate. You do that. The SUV pulled away, and Kevin stood in the driveway as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. He felt something shift, not in the wind, but in himself. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about every assumption that had ever tried to shrink him. That night, a different kind of silence blanketed the neighborhood. Not the tense, whispery quiet of Karen's reign, but the kind that comes after a storm. Cleansing. Final. Karen had tried to bury him under paperwork and prejudice. But Kevin had turned every page she threw at him into a stepping stone. And now, the steps were leading somewhere bigger. It was Sunday morning when Karen's moving truck pulled into the cul-de-sac, a bland, dented vehicle that seemed embarrassed by its own presence. The air was crisp, the sky indifferent, and yet a quiet electricity pulsed through the neighborhood. Curtains fluttered, blinds twitched. Eyes peeked through slits and slats, watching the spectacle unfold like a long-awaited season finale. Karen wasn't just moving out, she was being extracted, inch by inch, dignity packed away with each taped-up box. Kevin stood at his window, arms folded across his chest. No smug grin, no champagne in hand, just a stillness that bordered on reverence. He wasn't celebrating. He was witnessing. Because this wasn't just the eviction of a tenant. It was the slow dismantling of a throne built on arrogance. Karen had ruled these streets with the false comfort of superiority, a badge that had never been earned but always wielded. Now, stripped of her title and authority, she looked smaller. Human. Unarmored. She barked orders at the movers, 2 young men who moved with the weary indifference of hourly wages. Boxes clattered. A lamp snapped. Her voice cracked once, sharp like a twig underfoot. Kevin didn't need to hear the words to understand the desperation laced into them. It was the sound of a woman trying to control the last thing she had left, the illusion that she was still in charge. Across the street, neighbors stood in small clusters, pretending not to watch. Linda, the woman with the non-approved tulips, stood near her mailbox, arms folded tightly, as if holding back a storm of overdue vindication. She caught Kevin's eye and offered a subtle nod. He returned it. No words. Just an understanding. Poetic justice had a rhythm of its own, and today it was playing in Karen's driveway. Sandra had called earlier that morning with good news. The HOA board had voted unanimously to suspend Karen's privileges pending a formal review. That meant no more citations, no more rule twisting, and no more clipboards masquerading as power. Even better, An internal audit had found irregularities in her tenure, selective enforcement, missing receipts for minor fines, and at least 3 residents who were wrongly cited based on fabricated complaints. She could be liable, Sandra had said over the phone. If we press. But it's your call. Kevin had thought about it deeply. Vengeance was seductive, but true power, he realized, was in knowing when to let the final blow remain unthrown. Karen was already unraveling, and some defeats echo louder in silence. He stepped out onto his porch as the movers finished loading the last piece of furniture, a crooked coffee table with a chipped leg. Karen stood beside the truck, sweat streaking through the makeup she'd plastered on for dignity's sake. Her eyes flicked up, locking with his. For a moment neither spoke. Then, with slow steps, she crossed the lawn that no longer belonged to her kingdom. When she reached the edge of his porch, she stopped, arms stiff at her sides. "I never thought it would end like this," she said. Her voice wasn't angry now. It was worn, hollow, like she had been chewing on denial for days, and just realized it didn't nourish her anymore. Kevin studied her, not with contempt, but with a kind of curiosity. "And how did you think it would end?" Karen looked away, eyes blinking fast. "I don't know. I guess I thought, people like me always win." He nodded slowly. "That's the lie you were raised on." She swallowed. "I thought you were squatting. I really did. At first." "No," Kevin said quietly. "You thought I didn't belong. That's different." She opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't find the words. In that silence, the weight of everything she'd done, the citations, the confrontations, the assumptions, pressed down on her like gravity. "I wasn't raised to question that kind of thinking," she admitted finally. "I just followed the rules." Kevin's voice was soft but firm. "You followed the rules you created. Rules meant to keep people like me on the outside. And the worst part is, you never once asked yourself why." A long breath escaped her lips. Defeated. Karen looked at the moving truck like it might drive her back into a version of herself where none of this had happened. "I'm leaving," she said. "I don't expect forgiveness." "I'm not offering it," Kevin replied. But as she turned to leave, something within him stirred, not sympathy but understanding. Because when people like Karen fall, it's not just their pride that breaks. It's the mirror they've been staring into their whole lives, the one that only ever showed them one reflection, one version of what power looked like. As the truck pulled away, the street exhaled. Birds returned to chirping. Children resumed their bikes and sidewalk chalk. It was as if the whole block had shed something heavy. And Kevin, standing alone on his porch, knew the story wasn't over. Because what he had reclaimed wasn't just his house. It was his voice, his presence, his right to belong in a place that had been trained to believe he didn't. A month had passed since Karen's departure, and Willow Creek Estates had shifted like soil after a heavy rain, unsettled at first but richer for it. The silence that followed her exit was not absence, but renewal. No more whispered threats over flower beds. No more citations for mailbox colors or grass height. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it could breathe. Kevin had become something of a myth. Not in the exaggerated sense, but in the quiet way people speak about someone who disrupted the expected order. Some neighbors still walked on eggshells, unsure if they should wave or nod or keep their distance. Others were more courageous, like Linda, who now walked her dog past his house every morning just to say, "Good day, Mr. Hart," as if she were resetting the tone block by block. But Kevin wasn't interested in neighborhood fame. He wasn't here to be a symbol or a spectacle. He was here because he belonged. Because for far too long, black success had been allowed behind gates, but not inside them, tolerated only when it remained invisible, silent, safe. He wasn't here to assimilate. He was here to be seen. He stood in his kitchen one Saturday morning, pouring a cup of coffee, sunlight warming the marble countertops. Jazz played low in the background. Miles Davis, slow and moody. The kind of music that didn't ask for attention, but demanded respect. He looked out the window, not out of habit but reflection. Where Karen's energy had once polluted the air like invisible smog, now there was clarity. He had inherited not just a house, but a history, a community shaped by unspoken rules that he had just rewritten. And in that rewriting, something powerful had emerged, a new narrative. The HOA board had since undergone changes. Karen's position had been permanently revoked, and a new president elected, a retired professor named Mr. Calloway, who had lived in the neighborhood quietly for a decade. Black, dignified, and precise, Calloway ran meetings with logic instead of fear. Under his leadership, new policies were introduced, transparent enforcement procedures, anti-discrimination clauses, and community review panels. Kevin attended the meetings not to gloat, but to participate, to build, to witness the slow, necessary labor of change. "I hope you know what you started," Mr. Calloway told him one evening after a board session. Kevin sipped his water. "What's that?" "History," Calloway replied. "You didn't just evict a woman. You evicted a system." Kevin nodded slowly. One house at a time. But the story took its final twist when a letter arrived. Thick envelope. Cream-colored. Embossed lettering. It was from Karen. He stared at it for a long while before opening it. Not out of hesitation, but curiosity. What could she possibly say that hadn't already been buried under 30 days of silence? The letter was handwritten. Neat, unhurried. The kind of penmanship that revealed effort. "Kevin, I don't expect you to read this. I wouldn't blame you if you burned it. But I needed to say something without shouting or accusing or hiding behind rules I twisted into weapons. I left Willow Creek with more than boxes. I left with shame. And clarity. You were right. I didn't think you belonged. Not because of facts, but because of fear. The kind that's been handed down and dressed up as standards and values. I never questioned it. I enforced it. But you made me look in the mirror. And it cracked. I've started therapy. I'm reading. I'm listening. That may not mean much to you, but it means everything to me. I'm sorry. Not just for what I did to you, but for what I upheld without question. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to return some humanity to the space I took so much from. Karen, before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. Kevin folded the letter slowly, like handling something fragile. He didn't know what surprised him more, the apology or the fact that it sounded sincere. But forgiveness wasn't something he handed out like flyers. It wasn't his job to heal her. Still, he couldn't deny the quiet tremor of closure pressing at his chest. He stood in his backyard that night, looking at the stars. Not the sky, the stars. Bright and unapologetic. No ceiling above him. No ceiling inside him either. Karen was gone. The house was his. The silence was his. The future, well, that was his too. And for once, it didn't feel like he had to prove that. It just was.